Right. So, hello everyone, welcome to another lecture, which will be concerning our main topic of this year's edition of Game Days, which is accessibility and disabled gamers. We have with us over here Helios Moreau from France. Hello. And Helios is a freelance UX designer and user researcher. He studied game development and also cognitive science or something like that you mentioned. He will be talking hopefully a little bit more about that too, but mainly he will be talking about his upcoming new game, Alt Frequencies, which is a story-based adventure game with a lot of accessibility features and design in mind. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi. I'm gonna start. Okay. So hello everybody. My name is Helios. I'm a UX designer. And for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about accessibility in video games. So first of all, I'm going to start by quoting the Game Accessibility Guidelines website, which I will talk a bit more later during this lecture. So 15% of the population are disabled, rising to 20% amongst casual gamers. Other conditions that are not registered disability can also hit barriers. 14% of the adult population have a reading age of below 11 years old. 8% of males have red-green color deficiency, and many people have temporary impairments such as a broken arm. Many more have situational impairments such as playing in a noisy room or in bright sunlight, and all players have different levels of ability and different preferences. There is no typical gamer. So over the past few years, accessibility has become a huge topic in the field of video games, and more actions are taking place every day to allow as many people as possible to play and enjoy our games. So for me, UX design makes no sense if it doesn't include disabled players in the development process. So I strongly believe in taking every user into account in my work, but I know that sometimes if you don't know where to begin, it might seem a pretty huge task. So today what I'm going to do is share my experience as a developer on Alt Frequencies. And to do so, I'm going to give you some takeaways and some lessons that I've learned during a year of development in this project with some tools and some concepts. So first of all, I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more. So as I said, I'm a UX designer. I'm also a user researcher. I have a bachelor in cognitive psychology and a master degree in UX design. And I graduated from ENJMIN, which is a French school for game development, in September 2018. And for the past year, I've worked as a UX designer and user researcher at Accidental Queens, first as an intern and then as a freelance. So when I was working at ENJMIN, I've taken interest into the subject of accessibility in video games. And today, as I'm still learning about accessibility in general, I mostly have skills on mobile and in accessibility options for visually impaired and blind players, which is what got me to work with Accidental Queens on their third game called Alt Frequencies. So to tell you a bit about Accidental Queens, they are a small French studio that released 2 games before. A normal Lost Phone released in January 2017 and another Lost Phone released in September 2017. So to tell you a bit more about the game, Alt Frequencies is an audio-based game which revolves around the use of a radio device. The game takes place in a country that has decided to vote on implementing a time loop, but the people that are living in it don't know that the time loop is already in place. So you will have the possibility to browse through different radio stations, and you will have to record and send clips in order to influence the course of events. And the game is divided in several chapters, and each chapter revolves around the fact that every 3 minutes the time resets and you go back to the beginning. So the purpose of this game was to talk about how information is distributed and the way it can be manipulated. It's been released on iOS and Android, but also on Windows and Mac. And the most important part of my work in this game was that at the very beginning of the production, Accidental Queens wanted to provide several accessibility features, and especially for visually impaired and blind players. So my work here was to ensure that every design decision would be in keeping with the initial plan to have the game accessible for as many people as possible. So this takes me to the first takeaway of this lecture. Include accessibility in the game development as early as possible. So if you want to develop accessibility options in your game, you have to think about it right at the beginning and include it throughout the whole development process. Because the later you start thinking about it, the harder it gets to do it right. But with that said, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try at all. So what does it mean to have accessibility options in your mind right at the start of a project? It can mean a lot of different things. So if you've never heard about accessibility in video games before, the first thing you should do is getting to know the main types of disabilities that are usually addressed when it comes to accessibility features. So there is a great series of YouTube videos made by Mark Brown for the Game Maker's Toolkit channel that are called Designing for Disability. And those videos address auditory, visual, motor, and cognitive disabilities. And each video is about 10-15 minutes long, and it should give you a strong base to start working on accessibility on your game. So of course, this is just an example. In my case, I decided that for about 3 months when I was working at Accidental Queens, the majority of my work would be reading about accessibility in general and benchmarking audio-only and audio-based games. Just so you know, for the benchmark, I used a website called audiogames.net, and it's really great because it has a huge database of audio-based games, but also a lot of articles about designing audio games. And finally, as I said, when I was working at ENJMIN, during my first year project, I worked on an audio-only game, so meaning there was no visual at all. And a part of my work included researching about sound design, and especially notions such as sonification, which I don't have the time to explain properly, but basically it's the way to convey visual information using sound. I'm telling you this because it's an example, of course, and it's a way to show you that there are different ways to start taking interest and working on accessibility in video games. So once you know a bit more about disabilities and their implications in video games, you can start thinking about what to do in your video game. So during my research work at Accidental Queens, I came across a very valuable resource if you're looking to include accessibility features in your game. So there are the game accessibility guidelines. So this is a collaborative website, and it provides a developer-friendly list of references on how to include accessibility into your development process. So to explain a bit how the website worked, there are guidelines that are divided in 3 categories, so basic, intermediate, and advanced. And those categories are the result of a balance between the reach, the impact, and the value of the guidelines that you are trying to develop, to follow. And each of these categories are divided in subcategories related to types of skills and impairments. So as I said earlier, motor, cognitive, visual, and speech. This is a very great resource, and those guidelines are very important because by reviewing them, you will have the possibility to choose what's relevant to the game you are designing and according to your own production constraints. And if you review those guidelines at the beginning of the project and then throughout the whole development, you will be able to keep them in mind during the development process, but also you can plan the development and prioritize the guidelines. So to give you a small example, this is a screenshot that I took from a document that I made when I was working on alt frequencies. I'm not asking you to read everything because that's not important, but what I wanted to show you is that I took some guidelines from the website and I tried to see how it could apply to alt frequencies. In the end, we managed to do almost everything we wanted, but the priority was always on the guidelines related to accessibility features for blind and visually impaired players. So among all the contributors of this website, I started following the work of someone called Ian Hamilton, whose work is very important in the field. And it led me to following the work of a lot of other people that work on accessibility in video games, which takes me to the second takeaway of this lecture, get in touch with the community. So in this part, I'm going to give you a few examples of how we managed to get in touch with the community on alt frequencies. So the examples I'm going to give you apply to alt frequencies, but not to every project, of course. But what I want to show you is that you can find an active community with a lot of complementary skills in the matter. So first of all, during my first week working at Accidental Queens, I had the chance to attend the first European Game UX Summit. And it was even luckier for me that the motto of this particular summit was accessibility. All the talks are available on YouTube, by the way, and it's something that's worth taking a look at because it's really interesting. Then in October 2018, I attended the European Game Accessibility Conference. So the Game Accessibility Conference is an event that takes place since 2016, if I'm correct. And basically, it's a whole day where various speakers come and talk about different subjects related to accessibility in video games. So the speakers are developers, but also consultants and advocates, and also gamers that give their point of view on their use of video games. Attending this event allowed me to meet a lot of great people, and more importantly, it led me to build a strong technological watch. I didn't find a better name for it, I'm sorry. But I'm going to explain. So in my case, it happened via Twitter. Like a lot of people, I browse this social network daily. And it really helped me keeping in touch with what was happening in the field. So I'm going to give you a few examples of people I follow. I've talked about Ian Hamilton previously during this talk. So what I wanted to say was that a few weeks ago I started sending private messages to people I wanted to quote and give their IDs, their Twitter IDs during this talk to ask them if it was okay, basically. So Ian Hamilton said yes, otherwise he wouldn't be here. And he also added that people can contact him if they want to chat about anything related to game accessibility. So if you have any question, you can reach out to him. Next, I followed the work of Steve Saylor. He's an accessibility consultant and also a gamer, and he has a YouTube channel called Blind Gamer with Steve Saylor, where he plays various games, but also sometimes does videos to give his opinion on subjects that come up regarding accessibility in video games. He did a great video about the whole easy mode debate that happened a few months ago about Sekiro, and it's really worth watching it. And finally, Tara Volker is the co-director of the Game Accessibility Conference, and she's the Xbox Gaming and Disability Community Lead. I had the chance to attend one of her talks during the Game Accessibility Conference on how to build an inclusive tech lab. And I think I didn't say it earlier, but all the talks of the Game Accessibility Conference are available on YouTube as well. So it's very interesting if you want to know more about it. Of course, these are just examples of people I follow. It led me to following a lot of other different people. And more importantly, it really helped us during the development of our frequencies, and sometimes it even prevented us from making mistakes. For example, we reworked the whole structure of the menu because I read a thread by someone named Cherry Ray, who is also an accessibility consultant, and they were talking about the fact that having a specific accessibility menu in your menus contributes to excluding disabled players, because it gives the idea that accessibility options are something else, and it's not the case. So we worked our whole menu structure thanks to them. Finally, we got in touch with blind and visually impaired people thanks to the Applevis forum. So again, this applied to alt frequencies, but it's another example. So this forum is dedicated to iOS products, and it's made for and by blind and visually impaired users. People are very active on the community on this forum, and they talk a lot about their daily use of Apple devices. And you can, if you're developing an application or a game and you want to, you have questions about the features you're developing, you can ask and get a very useful answer. And also, we never got to do this on alt frequencies, but you can recruit beta testers for your games to get feedbacks. Because, of course, it's something to work on accessibility and talk with people about it, but you can't forget that nothing can replace proper playtesting. So the next takeaway is called Playtest Your Game. It might seem a little bit obvious, but it's very important to playtest your game in general. But more importantly, if you are designing accessibility options, it's important to playtest your game with disabled people. Unfortunately, I was the only UX designer on the project, and I had a limited amount of time and resource to conduct proper playtests. So we worked with French playtest laboratory in the north of France that is called PlayLab, and with them we conducted 2 playtests, one for the main version of the game and one for the free version of the game. I forgot to mention it, but there is a free version of the game on Windows and Mac, which is kind of a prequel to the events taking place in alt frequencies. So as you can see, we only conducted 2 playtests and only one on the main version. This happened because we had to record the voices so the game would be playable. But also we wanted to provide as much content as possible, so we wanted to have a few chapters implemented and some advanced sound design. And looking back on this, I think it wasn't a good idea at all, because having only one playtest that far into development is very risky, and trust me, we were kind of freaking out when we were waiting for the feedback. But fortunately, it went okay, so yay. But the situation we were in and the constraints we had influenced this. But as I said, looking back on this, I think we could have done more playtests, because I conducted a lot of playtests related to game design and scenario, and if I had the knowledge I have now, maybe I could have been able to conduct more playtests with blind players. Finally, we had constraints of recruitment, because so as I said, we wanted to playtest the game with blind players, but also that match the audience of the game, so narrative game enthusiasts. And finally, who spoke English, because at that time we didn't have any translation made, and as I said, we were working in France, so it wasn't easy, but PlayLab managed to come through and conduct some playtests, so it went pretty well. So playtesting your game with disabled players will allow you to get some very useful feedback and thus improve on your accessibility options. And more importantly, it will help you know more about your audience's gaming habits, which in our case really helped us when we were starting designing for screen readers. So the next takeaway is called look for tools to help you develop. So I'm going to share a small anecdote with you. So during the first takeaway, I showed you the game accessibility guidelines we tried to follow. One of those guidelines was ensure screen reader support for mobile devices. For those of you who don't know, a screen reader is a technology that allows visually impaired and blind people to interact with devices and have the content read aloud to them. It can be the text, but also the kind of interactions you can have, like if it's a button or a slider, etc., etc. On mobile, there are 2 main screen readers, so TalkBack on Android and VoiceOver on iOS. And on computer, NVDA for Windows and VoiceOver for Mac. Going back a bit on mobile devices, there is something called magic gestures. It's basically some gestures that are dedicated to one type of interaction that you can have with your device. So for example, a double tap with 2 fingers is pausing a game. This magic gesture is the same for Android and iOS, but also not all of the magic gestures are the same for talkback and voiceover. So if you are designing for screen readers, it's something you have to keep in mind. So going back on alt frequencies, given the large amount of speech that was already in the game itself, what we decided was to enable screen readers only for navigating the menus. And as we were developing on Unity, we realized that Unity does not support screen readers developing. So it was kind of a big problem for us, as you can guess. So we tried researching what we could do about it, and it turns out that there were a lot of other people that were in the same situation that wanted to design and develop for screen reader support on their applications or game, but couldn't because Unity doesn't support it. So luckily, there is someone who kind of grew tired of this at some point and decided to create their own plugin for Unity. So it's called the Unity Accessibility plugin. So you have the possibility to create voiceover for different types of content, as I said earlier, text, buttons, etc. And you can also customize the text that is being read aloud, which is very interesting because in our case, we could provide, with the same screen, we could provide different information for sighted players and for blind players. So it was really nice that we could customize the text. Finally, this is a plugin that is pretty simple to learn and use. I myself, I'm not a programmer, and when I started working at Accidental Queens, I hadn't touched Unity in several months. But I managed to use this plugin and to implement the screen reader support on all the menus. And so you don't know me very well, but given my personal skills in programming, that is saying a lot. And finally, there is a lot of documentation on this plugin. The person that developed it is very active on forums, so you can ask questions if you want to do something and you don't know how. And there is also a Trello board with the features that they are currently working on related to the plugin and what they plan to work on, what is already available, etc., etc. So this is an example. I'm going to give you some other examples of tools and plugins now on Unreal Engine. A lot of people started developing plugins for game engines, actually. To give you some example, someone developed a plugin to make games accessible for blind and low vision players, and it's called Accessible Realities. There is also a tool called Yellow Subs Machine, which helps developers create proper subtitles for their games. And I'm going to make a small parenthesis here, but I think subtitles are a very good example. Subtitles are used by a lot of people in video games. I use them all the time when I play. And yet, there are very few games that do subtitles properly. And I think that one of the main reasons behind this is that the engines that we use to develop games do not provide us with proper tools to do it. Finally, on Unreal Engine 4, there is a built-in color blindness simulator. So as I said, most of those tools are still developed by users of these engines and not built in the engines themselves. So I hope that it will become more and more present in engines so that we can include accessibility more easily in our development processes. Okay, so far I've given you some information about how to include accessibility in your game in your development in general. Now I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into our design process on alt frequencies. So when I was benchmarking audio games, I realized that there were a lot of audio-only games, so meaning there were no visuals at all. And there was little to no communication about those games outside of blind players and audio game enthusiasts. And I know that video games have a strong social aspect. So I believe that sharing those games and sharing in the industry and in the public is what helps games become more and more accessible. So as I was reading articles about designing audio games, I came across this notion that is equivalently accessible games, and it was very important for us. Quickly to tell you what is an equivalently accessible game. So creating equivalently accessible games means that everyone can experience the game the way you intended it to be, no matter what abilities they have at a given time. As I said, it was a very important notion for us to discover early in the development, because we tried to keep it in mind during the whole development, because we wanted to create a game that anybody could play and that anybody could share with their friends and families, etc. And so this notion helped us guide our design decision throughout the whole process. So how did it apply to alt frequencies? Well, what we did was to find the information that were important to and necessary to play and enjoy the game, and we listed them. And once this list was done, we worked closely between visual and sound design to provide those information in those two modalities. So in this case, this is close to the notion of multimodal feedback. When players interact with the game, they need to know when they are doing any action, basically. So that's why there are both visual and audio feedback for each interaction. So I'm going to give you a few examples on how we did it. First of all, about the interface and the controls. In that case, all my work about sound design was very useful, because we used some notions such as auditory icons and auditory earcones to help design the audio feedback when you interact with the game. Just to be quick, because then again it would take me too much time to explain it properly, but auditory icons are sounds that have a semantic connection to the physical events that they represent. In our case, we used them for interactions that were directly related to the use of the radio device. So for example, recording a clip, switching to another station, or send a clip. I'm gonna give you a small sample of what happens when you record a clip. I hope it will. Okay. So as you can hear, it gives you kind of an idea of a big old school radio device. Of course, in our game, the device is not a big old school radio device, but when you hear this, you think about, okay, there is something that is being recorded. So basically, that's an auditory icon. And on the other hand, auditory earcones are songs that are more abstract, and they require learning a grammar. So we used those sounds for the interactions that were more related to the gameplay itself. So for example, you can fast forward in the game if you want to go to the next clip, and you can listen to a clip that you have previously recorded if you don't remember what it is. But the example I wanted to give you was the sound that you hear when the time resets. So I'm going to let you listen a little bit about it. So as I said, this sound is a more abstract sound. We spend a lot of time trying to do it properly, because as far as I'm concerned, I don't know what a time loop sounds like. So the idea was that players needed to learn that when they heard this sound, it meant that the time was looping in the game. But of course, those examples are what I call a one-for-one information, meaning that you have this interaction and the visuals are this and the sounds are this. But it's not always relevant. So I'm going to give you some examples about the characters and stations now. Regarding characters, as you can see here, the characters have their names that are displayed with a specific color code and shape for the speech bubble. But of course, we couldn't enunciate the name of each character speaking every time they spoke, because otherwise it would have completely broken the pace of the game. So, of course, the distinct voices of characters helped players identify them, but we also made sure that the name of characters were said every once in a while, and at least once per chapter, if I'm correct. So about the station's identity, it's pretty much the same. With the visuals, you have a color code and a specific logo for each station. And now I'm going to give you some examples of what it sounds like. So the first is News One. It's kind of a typical news radio. The clip I'm going to make you listen is the jingle that you can hear at the start of the first chapter of the game. And there is a jingle that enunciates the name of the main journalist, Fred Peterson, and also kind of a mood that gives, a news radio mood.
This is News One.
And here are the headlines with Fred Peterson.
Okay, so this is an example. The next one is Fresh FM. This radio has more of a younger audience, so we wanted to provide a mood. Well, of course, on this station there is a lot of music, but also some kind of upbeat background music that you can hear while the characters are speaking. So I'm gonna let you listen a bit of it. So it's basically very typical upbeat music that you can hear while characters are speaking. And finally, the last example I wanted to give you was the example of the pirate station, because it's a station that is very different from the other. So in the story, the pirate station is hosted by someone named Winston, and he's kind of trying to tell people the truth about the fact that the time loop is already in place. So we wanted to give a kind of a DIY mood, like he's hiding and is broadcasting secretly. So he's maybe in his basement or something, and he doesn't have a lot of professional material to do so. So what we did was have a filter on his voice, and sometimes some white noise in between his lines. So this is an example, again, from the first chapter of the game.
You're currently listening to Winston. I can't reveal more about...
Okay, so what we tried to do here was to build some strong audio identities for each stations and each characters. So people could really easily identify them without having to have a specific visual logo or the name of the station. To give you one last example, because it's another constraint that we had, at the beginning of the development, I was playtesting the game with people, and I saw that a lot of players tend to miss out on important information because they were sending a clip to a station and they didn't wait to have the reaction to the clip that they had just sent. And they were switching to another station, and so they missed out on very important information. So what we needed to do was to force players to stay on the station to get the information. Of course, this is hard because if you don't, at that time, you can't interact with the game because you need to pay attention to what is broadcasted. But it can become very frustrating if you don't know why suddenly you can't interact with your game. So in the case of the visuals, we had a different color for the speech bubble, and we grayed out the rest of the screens so player would understand that they couldn't interact with the game. But we needed to do the same using only sound. So what we did in the end was work with auditory earcones again, and have a specific audio cue that happens at the beginning and at the end of what we called an audiomatic, and a specific background sound so people would understand that when they hear this, it means that they can't interact with the game. So I'm going to give you a short clip about it. So of course, I don't know if, yeah, you can hear a bit. Of course this happens, there are the voices of radio hosts on top of it. And there is an audio cue that also signals the fact that it's over and you can start interacting with the game again. So what I've given you here are examples on how to provide relevant information both with visuals and sound. But what I wanted to show you is that there are very different ways to do so, and with the proper documentation, it's not that hard to do. But more importantly, we tried to follow this rule of having an equivalently accessible game, but what we didn't realize at that time, and we realized later, luckily, was that it also means creating accessibility features and options so players can decide how they want to play your game. So this takes me to the next and last takeaway of this lecture. Customization is key. So in this part, I'm going to share a specific anecdote with you, the one that got me to realize this takeaway. So initially, the game, about the way of interacting with the game and the controls, the game used some specific gestures for each interaction, and it could be done anywhere on the screen. And some of those gestures were 2 fingers gestures. But at some point, we decided to rework the gesture design because we wanted the game to be also playable with 1 hand and or 1 finger. And because we also realized that some gestures that we used were already used as magic gestures with a screen reader, so it could become very confusing. And we also needed to have no targets to hit on the screen, because if, like us, you decide you don't plan to allow screen reader support into the game like we did, you can have any target to hit. And finally, in the meantime, when I was conducting playtest with sighted players, they almost always said that they wanted some buttons because they wanted to press buttons directly on the radio. And so what we did was try to design the perfect gesture mode that could match all those constraints. And spoiler alert, it didn't work. So a bit before the Game Accessibility Conference, we were really struggling with this design because we couldn't do everything we wanted. So we were trying to think about, yeah, maybe we could provide a specific mode with only buttons and have like the magic gesture to pause the game, but also a pause button directly on the screen and stuff like that. And then the Game Accessibility Conference came up and something hit me. Almost every speaker that day mentioned at some point during their talk that it was important to provide options so players could customize their experience and decide to play the game as they want to. So this is the most important takeaway that I had during this whole year of development. You can't have a one-size-fits-all solution of playing your game because that's not how it works. We wanted to create one great accessible game that would work for everybody on the first try they launched the game, but well, we couldn't do it, obviously, and that's okay, and it's maybe even better now, because in the end, what we tried to do was to provide as much customization as possible. So we gave players a choice on how they wanted to play. So as you can see, there are a few examples. You can decide to play with gestures or with buttons on the mobile version. On the PC version, the controls are fully remappable. I'm not sure. You can remap your controls fully if you want, and with a keyboard or with a controller. You can also manage the sound of the game. You can enable closed captions if you play with text and you want description of what's happening. And you can also, as I said, enable or disable the screen reader directly from the game. So I'm going to conclude on this whole lecture. Alt Frequencies is the first game I've ever released. And as I'm talking right now, the game has been out for about 2 weeks. And it's the result of nearly a year and a half of work with a team of 7 people. Unfortunately, we didn't get to do everything we wanted accessibility-wise in the game, whether it was out of time or out material constraints. So, for example, we initially wanted to have accessibility options for deaf and hard of hearing people. But we quickly realized that it would mean some sign language captioning, and we couldn't do it because we didn't have enough information on how to do this, basically. So what we did in the end was doing our best to provide some good closed captionings. But as I said, there is a lot that we wanted to do, and we couldn't do because we didn't have time and or enough money to do properly. The game isn't perfect. We've made several mistakes that we are trying to fix right now. There are some updates that are supposed to come up real soon based on feedback we got from players that tested our game. However, I believe that we did our best and we learned a lot. So maybe the next game each of us will be working on will be improved related to accessibility options. So with that said, saying that developing accessibility option costs a lot is not an excuse to do nothing, of course, because it's true that we couldn't afford some of those features, but the reality here is that the more documentation there is, the more developers come and share their experience, the less we'll need to research and think about those options and iterate on it. So documenting what we do and sharing it will hopefully allow everybody to include accessibility in their design. So that's basically why I'm here today. I wanted to give you one last important message, and I didn't know where to put it, so I figured that the end of the talk would be better so you would remember it. So here goes. Please hire disabled consultants and advocates to do consulting on your projects. And remember that whatever I told you today, I was able to do it thanks to the work of a lot of other people that deserve the real credit here. So with this talk, I wanted to show you that it's possible to include accessibility in your game, even if it's your first year or first project in the industry, if you have a limited amount of resource and or experience, and even if you don't know where to begin. So I hope that sharing my experience on alt frequencies was helpful, and that I've given you enough insights and resources so you can include accessibility on your next project if it's not already the case. So we as an industry must do more about accessibility in video games, because there is still a lot of work to do, but each year I see that we're moving so much forward in this field, and we need to keep on working to make video games as inclusive and accessible as possible. So thank you all so much for attending this talk. If you have any questions now after, don't hesitate, come talk to me. You can follow me on Twitter. My DMs are supposed to be open, so if you have a question, don't hesitate.
Are there any questions?
I can only answer for Accidental Queens. I forgot to tell it, so thank you. These are some premium games. And I have to say I don't know how it goes for other games related to accessibility features and options.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I think I read somewhere that your projects are being supported by public funding. So is that true?
This one, no. The first game of Accidental Queens, A Normal Lost Fun, was supported by crowdfunding. But no, we worked in a co-production with Arte, and we had a publisher called Plugin Digital.
But it's a public institution, right?
It's a
yeah.
broadcaster, right?
Yeah, it's like yeah, it's mainly known for a TV channel, but they also worked in co-productions with some game studios to release some video games in the past.
And I think, and my question from that is, it's incentives or more pressure for the studio to focus on accessibility, or if it was just purely kind of your initiative, like internal initiative of the company?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure, and I understand the question. If you can.
Okay, so like the initiative to focus on these accessibility features, did it come from like internally from the company, or is it in a way kind of mandated?
Subsidized maybe in some way.
So in our case, it was Accidental Queens that wanted to start working on accessibility options in their game. It happened that Arte was very interested in our initiative, and also the fact that the game was audio-based was also something that interested them. But mainly, no, it came from us.
So you mentioned that you did some research also on the website audiogames.net. Did you also play some games? Audio games?
I played some, but to be honest, it was a long time ago, so
Yeah.
I don't remember every game I played. But I played.
I mean, my question would be, how would you compare them to your game and to, like, let's say, regular games in general? What do you think is the biggest difference, and maybe what we can learn from them?
Well, compared to other mainstream games, I think that the fact that they rely so much on audio is very important, because sound design in general tends to be kind of left out of productions in video games. So I think it's very important to raise awareness about it, because it's as important as anything else in a video game, in my opinion. And related to our game, as I said, most of the games I played were audio-only games, so there were no visuals at all. And what we wanted to do was to provide the two modalities. Like, you can play the game with both visual and sound, but you can play it with only sound, or only with visuals, but with some limits, as I said during the talk.
Are there any other questions? If not, then Helios, thank you very much for a very resourceful presentation. You did all the research for us. You should be able to play alt frequencies right now. It's available basically everywhere on all the stores. But if you want, you can also check it out downstairs in the cubic space where we have our speaker games exhibition showcase or something like that. I don't know the name, sorry. Yeah, but do check it out. Do talk to Helios. He will be around, so we're looking forward to having you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.